Walter Benjamin corresponded for 10 years, from their first meeting in Berlin in 1930 to Benjamin's death in 1940. He killed himself after having tried to escape from occupied France by hiking through the Pyrenees. He had a transit visa for Spain and an entrance visa for the US, but did not have an exit visa from France. He had a heart condition and may have feared another mountain climb. Gretel Karplus married Theodor Wiesengrün Adorno and moved to New York, where she was instrumental in gaining the letters from Max Horkheimer, on the basis of which Benjamin was awarded a non-quota academic visa. In the 1950s, she moved to Frankfurt with Adorno. She died in 1993, 23 years after she attempted suicide in the year after Adorno's death. The obituary in the Frankfurter Rundschau in 1993 asserts a negative, raising a distressing question about time, history, and knowledge. Those who only met Gretel in the last 24 years of her life never knew the woman she had once been. Writing about these lives, what a historian starts with is death. Benjamin's suicide, Karplus Adorno's bundled action, her failed suicide. A psychoanalytic account of the symptom argues that it works nocturnally, with early events taking on meaning belatedly and with actions having effect in nonlinear and often unknowable ways. The materialist history that Benjamin called for is also symptomatic, nocturnally. This paper is an attempt at that kind of work, a fragment of what Stefan Zweig called the world of yesterday, recovered by reading letters symptomatically. The people I write about are dead, and the time through which they lived became catastrophe. For me, as an intellectual historian, as well as an analyst in formation, Gretel Karplus Adorno's letters offer an opportunity to recover something of a particular Jewish woman's life in 1930s Berlin, to gain a sense of what mattered to her, of where her jouissance lay. Partly, that was an intellectual debate, partly in giving gifts, whether of money or a pretty piece of fabric. Walter Benjamin's letters to Karplus offer rare moments of openness about his emotions, as well as profound philosophical musings, illuminating what he meant by a materialist history. Although the past is irrecoverable, its effects are still present. Letters, although writing, have something of the effect of speech. There's desire, there's jouissance, there's the have-said. Most of all, writing from occupied France in July 1940, for Benjamin, there's the fear of death. What's meaningful is how he faces it. Writing from Lourdes, Benjamin conveys his fear that the hoped-for US visa will have arrived too late. He expresses his confidence in her effort and tenacity. But, he writes, we have only a limited time. You can be sure, on the other hand, that I have maintained the only state of mind befitting someone exposed to risks that he should have foreseen and which he brought upon himself in the knowledge of their causes, or almost. Benjamin signifies lateness, difficulty, tenacity, risk, and self-blame, that masochistic turn of his realization of his implication in his own suffering, if read from an analyst's vertex, are all indicative of structure. He is obsessional. Benjamin's brooding disbelief in death leads him to a stoical, philosophical retreat from affect, state of mind, and to calculation, risks that he should have foreseen, and knowledge, almost. This almost is what might bring an obsessional to the consulting room, the tentative beginning of transference, the turn to a subject supposed to know. Benjamin's almost is a pause for thought and also an invitation. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, as I speculate towards the end of this paper, this knowledge almost is real, is a way to theorize in unsaturated terms, without the imaginary, without the symbolic, holding on, in Benjamin's words, to irreconcilable juxtapositions, perhaps, to use Mikhail Romanowitz's formulation, mapping them on complex non-Euclidean planes. It was Gretel Karplus who initiated the use of the intimate pronoun du in the correspondence. It was also she who put into words the meaning of this friendship, and perhaps, to use psychoanalytic language, the transferences that made up this friendship. They correspond intimately, and yet they address each other by pseudonyms. The secret names are a way to evade political censorship, but also, as Karplus emphasizes, their friends do not know how intimate Detlev and Felicitas are. Those are their pseudonyms. Gretel herself knows little about their relationship. There's something unknowing, unconscious. She writes in 1933, "Not a soul knows about Detlev and Felicitas. I myself have only an inkling of our relationship. So how could I tell anyone about it? In my life, despite its invisibility, it is perhaps the most solid thing I have, the only thing I wish to rely upon without always having to be fearful and on my guard. Forgive me for telling you so much about it today. I would suffocate otherwise." Karplus makes connections between silence, how can I tell anyone about it, ignorance, only an inkling, and secrecy, not a soul knows. Not telling, speech, is associated with not being seen. The object cause of desire is both voice and gaze, absent and less reliable, a defensive fantasy of lack of defenses, an apology for communication. Voice becomes breath rather than word. This hysterically suffering embodiment is described here as suffocation. This is not her only hysterical body symptom. She also talks about her migraines. Towards the end of this letter, she discusses her relation to the other, object of knowledge. "I have the feeling I see you differently than other people do, but you do not fare any the worse for it, as I still know everything they do, but unlike them, it does not scare me off and prevent me from exploring other parts of you. Knowledge, thematized as vision, is not unitary. She sees him differently. This difference could harm, and it could repel. What she is discussing is anxiety, anxiety at the thematization of the gaze as knowledge. In another letter written in 1933, she had said that there is great longing captured within the secret names, and often precisely the opposite of real existence, which I nonetheless do not wish to deny, even if it is forcing me, especially now, to sit diligently in the office from morning to evening, and preferably stay put there." Karplus opposes the dailiness of real life, the office work that forces one to stay put, to longing. Real existence is every day. Longing is flight, but a kind of flight where one is carried away by others. Longing is, she realizes, her most powerful relation to the other. In a long letter that starts with exasperation at Benjamin, his reluctance to move, she talks about the two men she is in love with and her realization that she loves both of them. She's longing, she desires to be taken away by one or other man, as long as I knew for certain that I would be taken away, whether to England, America, or the ends of the earth. Karplus was a businesswoman, a partner in the glove factory bought after the sale of her father's leather factory. After the unexpected death of her business partner, she found it impossible to carry on as manager, being a Jewish woman in Nazi Berlin. She still feels this longing for Adorno, she says, has adapted my entire being to this union. And yet I have been having doubts as to whether I may have overestimated myself, whether I will be up to the task. I know how much Teddy needs glamour, beauty, and variety. Where am I to get all that, now that I am long since not so young anymore and have no income or property of my own? Jouissance is either too little or too much. Here, for Gretel, it's too little. She has too little glamour, no money or property. She feels she is an inadequate object little a. Her hysterical question about gender is also a political one, a question of her time. After marrying Adorno, she had an office at the Institute of Social Research, both in New York and after the war in Frankfurt, but her role was undefined. The students called her Dracodont, playing on Adorno's pet name for her, the Tracodont, to his mastodon. There's no such dinosaur, no such trachodon. An American feminist historian, who's the only person who's written about Karplus, speculates that it may mean dragon lady. Karplus attempted suicide after Adorno's death and lived for another 23 years. She destroyed her private papers, and there's very little documentation of her life, the last 20 years of her life. I'll skip a sentence. The obituary uses the signifier shadows to talk about her, living in shadows, a woman of shadow. The one scholarly work on her picks up on this signifier, but there's still a lot more that we can argue. I've argued that the signifiers Karplus uses to write about the effect of the secret names, silence and oh, sorry, I'm repeating that. Yeah. There's another example of the way in which this question of gender becomes a historical question. When the Adornos were in America for a year away from their appointment in the Frankfurt School, another couple were hired to replace them. And the woman who was asked to take on Gretel Karplus's role said, "I'm not a sociologist. Why have they hired me to be at the Frankfurt School?" And Horkheimer responded, "Gretel Adorno is a chemist. Is that any comfort to her? And yet she is the life and soul of the Institute. The students trust her." These signifiers, comfort, life and soul, trust, are moral terms rather than the language of employment and CVs. So we could see that there is a move that we can make from the psychoanalytic analysis of the way in which she can be understood to a more political and historical understanding, focusing on these same signifiers. So it becomes a question of history and of the public. Now, I've talked about Gretel Karplus in terms of a rather straightforward Lacanian understanding of hysteria as where the woman is related more directly to the object little a and relates to the phallus through the mediation of a man with whom she has a relationship. We could speculate that this had a lot to do with Gretel Karplus Adorno's subjectivity, and that this may have something to do with her acute suffering in the last 23 years of her life, and the shadow that she lived in that point, and the polite silence about the last 23 years of her life, when she no longer had the master as the partenaire to her hysterical subjectivity. But there, if we want to understand Benjamin as an obsessional neurotic, I think we need to move away from this Lacanian notion of the grid of sexuation and return to Freud, and to Freud's discussion of obsessional neurosis in terms of multiple relations of love and hate, multiple object relations within the duality of the drug, rather than the more straightforward Oedipus simplex within which we can understand a lot of hysterical subjectivity. We could see this coming out in an exchange of letters between Karplus and Benjamin. In 1934, Karplus devotes most of a long letter to what she refers to as the subject she is reluctant to discuss in writing, Benjamin's friendship with Bertolt Brecht, which was disapproved of by Karplus, Adorno, and Scholem, who with Brecht are Benjamin's closest friends. Her argument is psychoanalytic. You are somehow under his influence, which is great danger to you. I think this relationship is very emotionally loaded for you, and also perhaps stands for something entirely different. Benjamin's reply in early June 1934 addresses Karplus's psychoanalytic interpretation. What you wrote about his influence on me calls to mind a significant and recurring constellation in my life. A similar influence was exerted on me, according to my friends, by Heimler, as also in the opinion of my later wife, who at that time fought passionately against it, by Gutmann. It was claimed that I was under his suggestion. Perhaps it surprises you that I'm going so far back, but I must do so in order for you to understand how, without denying your words, I can stand fast in the face of them. Benjamin signifies the psychoanalytic, calls to mind, going so far back to explain these things, free association and Nachträglichkeit. Like Karplus, he also uses the signifiers influence and suggestion. This is trance, the hypnotic discourse that Freud repudiated and that Ferenczi retained. And there's a big debate about whether we can use notions of trance to understand psychoanalytic practice nowadays. But what of desire and jouissance? Benjamin says that his relationship with Brecht, like the relationships with Heimler and Gutmann, provokes a strong protest from his friends and his wife. His friends' jouissance is their protest, their suffering. Those relationships have always provoked more or less vigorous protests from those close to me, those ties whose perils are evident enough. Benjamin's own jouissance is also a response to danger, something to do with anxiety, but as much to do with thought as life. In the economy of my existence, there are indeed a handful of decisive relationships that enable me to occupy a position that is the polar opposite of my original being. And he goes on to talk about his thinking is characterized by extremes, the breadth it thus exerts, the freedom to juxtapose objects and thoughts that seem irreconcilable takes shape only in the face of danger. He's speculating about his psychic structure, the economy of my existence. The structure is like a globe, they're polar opposites. This is an enabling structure. It leads to breadth, the freedom to juxtapose objects and thoughts that seemed irreconcilable. In part, these polar opposites are object relations, directed to both men and women. Thus, in a 1931 diary entry, Benjamin picked 2 flowers, a rose and a peony. He decided to drop in on Brecht. He held the flowers in a book. The flowers peeked out of it, and when someone joked about them, my embarrassment grew. What peeks out, of course, is desire. Benjamin writes that he decides to hoist it like a flag, but, he says, this idea was a complete failure. He tries to give the peony to Brecht. Benjamin's signifier is irony. In the face of Brecht's ironic jokes, I no less ironically presented him with the peony, keeping a firm grip on the dog rose. Of course, Brecht refused to accept it. Benjamin places the rejected gift in a vase of blue flowers. Then he throws the rose, which he wanted to give to Hauptmann, Brecht's lover, into the vase's where, he says, it stuck, jutting out awkwardly. So you see the dual relations, the object relations to both women and men, and the complicated obsessional logic and the delaying and recomplication there. This story is funny in some ways. It's about bungled actions and irony. But Benjamin is more apt to think of connections between love and death than love and bungled action. For example, a young man he encountered on a mountain. Actually, this young man was Gauguin's grandson, so it's interesting historically as well. Reminded him of his dead friend, Heimler. He writes to Karplus in letter 16 that he and this young man saw a mysterious sight, black-garbed women on a mountain awaiting a funeral. A thought figure, Agisileo Santander, written a few months later, develops the connections between bisexual object relations and death further. The thought figure tropes on Clay's angel, Benjamin's prized possession, that hung on Karplus's office wall until her failed suicide attempt, after which it was sent to the museum in Israel. Benjamin writes that the angel sent his feminine aspect after the masculine one reproduced in the picture, and did so by the most circuitous, most fatal detour, even though the two had been such close neighbors. For nothing can overcome my patience. Its pinions resemble those of the angel. They need but a few moments to hold it stationary in the face of the woman whom it is determined to await. And so, scarcely had I seen you for the first time that I returned with you to where I had come from. The angel has two aspects, each has a partner. Time is circuitous. Benjamin's response is patience, winged but motionless, outside time. The image is sexual, spasms, like an orgasm. This is not desire, limited. This is jouissance, love and suffering. The thought figure ends in a return to the womb. Death and sex combined in a representation of maternal femininity, the return to where I had come from. Time is circular. In the second version of Irreconcilable Santander, written a day later, the death drive is turned outward. Whenever this man encountered a woman who held him in thrall, he at once determined to lie in wait for her on her journey through life, and to wait until she fell into his hands, ill, aged, and in ragged clothes. In short, nothing could overcome the man's patience. The angel's feminine aspect holds him in thrall. This is reversed. He lies in wait, and she is degraded, ill, aged, and in ragged clothes. Time resumes, but the object decays, and the subject is vengeful. Irreconcilable Santander's first version ends with circular time, a woman's death image. The second version softens death to decay and reverses the valuation of the object. There's something very convoluted and obsessional about the identification with the angel, with its various aspects and his patience. It also, as identification, is imaginary. Or perhaps, we might speculate, it can also be real, irreconcilable, impossible. In Benjamin's posthumously published On the Concept of History, Clay's angel becomes the angel of history, and its wings no longer hold back time. It is swept backwards. The subject gains a weak messianic power, mystical, and thus real in Lacan's sense. The circularity of time, in a return to where I had come from, becomes historical, and yet remains nonlinear. Rather than causality, we have consequences, debt. There is a claim laid upon us. Then, like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power on which the past has a claim. Such a claim cannot be settled cheaply. As Benjamin writes to Karplus in letter 178, written in Paris in 1940, sometime between April and May, the war and the constellation that brought it about led me to take down a few thoughts which I can say that I have kept with me, indeed kept from myself, for nigh upon 20 years. That is why I have barely afforded you more than fleeting glances at them. The conversation under the horse chestnut trees was a breach in those 20 years. Even today, I'm handing them to you more as a bouquet of whispering grasses gathered on reflective walks than a collection of theses. I do not know to what extent reading it will surprise or even disconcert you, which I hope it will not. Benjamin's emphasis is on unknowing, thoughts kept from myself, thoughts kept with me, kept from myself, the unconscious. Perhaps in writing about Benjamin and Karplus, I'm writing about the past that indeed does have a claim upon me. I cannot pay a debt to the 6 million Jews dead in the Shoah, but perhaps I can provide a space in my writing, in a conference paper, for their letters to speak.